Welcome. Welcome to the Western Library. It's great to see so many people here on a Wednesday evening in Oxford. My name is Ben Caldecott. I direct something called the Oxford Sustainable Finance Group based at the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment. I've had the great pleasure of chairing the judging panel for the University of Oxford Prize for Greening Finance, together with a group of leading academics and practitioners who work on those topics. And the prize was established in 2023 to recognise research and service that helps society to understand how environmental change influences finance and investment, and how economic and financial systems can contribute to global environmental sustainability. And an endowment has been established at the university to support this prize in perpetuity, with initial donation being provided by Insight Investment. In 2024, so last year, the panel selected winners for two categories, the two categories that we have. The first is the Outstanding Research category, and the other is the Outstanding Service category. We held the public lecture for the winner of the Outstanding Research category earlier in June, and that was Professor Rob Bauer from Maastricht University for his groundbreaking work in sustainable finance and responsible investing, particularly focused on asset owners and pension funds. This evening, we focus on the winner of the Outstanding Service Prize, awarded to recognise outstanding service from individuals or not-for-profit organisations who have made a special contribution to the furtherance of greening finance. And as you can imagine, there was quite a crowded field of really impressive individuals and organisations who were nominated for that prize last year, and one really stood out, and that was Emmanuel Faber, who is here, who's the chair of the International Sustainability Standards Board. And obviously, Emmanuel's not just competing with individuals, but also with organisations who work in this space. His work and impact will be well known to many of you already, but I did want to quickly read out the prize citation from the judging panel. So bear with me when I do that. The Outstanding Service category is awarded to Emmanuel Faber for his exceptional leadership in advancing sustainability in the corporate world, and for his pivotal role in developing global sustainability disclosure standards. As chair of the ISSB, he's been instrumental in creating comprehensive global baseline of sustainability disclosures for capital markets. His work has been crucial in harmonising and elevating sustainability reporting practices worldwide, providing investors with consistent, comparable, and reliable information on companies' sustainability-related risks and opportunities. Prior to his role at the ISSB, as the former chair and CEO of Danone, he demonstrated how large listed corporations can integrate sustainability into their core business strategies, pioneering innovative approaches to future-proofing economics. Throughout the years, he has shown his unwavering commitment to sustainable business practices and his ability to drive systemic change. His visionary leadership continues to inspire and guide the financial sector towards a more sustainable and resilient future. So we, judging panel, clearly held Emmanuel's achievements in high regard, as I'm sure you do too. And his prize lecture this evening is entitled Future-Proofing Capital Markets with Sustainability Disclosures, and we look forward to hearing his reflections on building a global baseline for decision-useful reporting and what's going to come next in a very kind of turbulent, changing context. Now, before I hand over to Emmanuel, just a couple of housekeeping points. So after his lecture, we're going to have around 20-25 minutes or so for some moderated Q&A. Filming and photography are taking place this evening. So if you ask a question later, please do think about what kind of questions you might ask. Please remember to use the microphones as well, so you can your questions can be captured in the recordings. And the recording will be made available after the event as well. And please do share that with your colleagues and with your networks, and links and things will be shared with people. After the Q&A, we're going to move back to where we were for kind of tea and coffee beforehand, and there'll be drinks and some canapes. So please do stick around for that. Some of you are going to be attending a dinner afterwards. You should know who you are. Please head to the venue, which is across the road in the main Bodleian Library at 7:15, We're going to be seated at 7:30. So, finally, on behalf of the University of Oxford, big thanks to Insight Investment for their support for the prize, to our judging panel for their continued diligence and independence, and to colleagues here at the Bodleian and at the Smith School and at the Oxford Sustainable Finance Group for making tonight possible with all of their help and support. So, Emmanuel, many congratulations. We're honoured to have you, and over to you.
Thank you, Ben, for the kind words about our work and my contribution. There is a lot of personal and collective mixed emotions in receiving this prize here. And I just want to start by saying a big thank you and express my, how grateful we are to the panel, of course, to the Oxford leadership that made it possible, and to Insight Investment for their contribution to this event and this award for us. Maybe I can start, weaving the personal aspect with the collective, with the fact that me being back here at Oxford for I think the third time now in my long life, it started 25 years ago when I had been appointed the CFO for Danone, one of the large food businesses around the world. And we started a really interesting conversation with another colleague CFO in the industry from Mars, Olivier Goudet, at that point in time. The two French guys around. And so he was in Virginia, McLean, I was in Paris at that time. But we started to discuss about, beyond finance, what the purpose of our companies were. And this is where I discovered that back in 1947, maybe some of you know that Forrest Mars had written a paper left in a drawer somewhere that was to be found by the next generation of the family about what he called economics of mutuality, describing a business basically being interdependent with a lot of their ecosystem partners in the business. And we started these conversations, and they deepened in so many different ways. And that paved the way, I think, based on the long history of having a dual purpose as a company for Danone, to make Danone a legally purpose-driven enterprise in the law of France in 2020, with the support of 99% of our shareholders. And in between that, there have been a couple of visits here at Oxford, and this is where the collective starts also to play, because that was with Saïd Business School at the time. Colin Mayer was with Bruno Roche, who was the chief economist at Mars, starting to discuss and teach and research around economics of mutuality. And then later on in 21, a pretty collective paper was issued on purpose and the integrated framework. And my dear colleague, Richard Barker, was in the long list of colleagues here, Bruno and Colin and others and Clara Barbie, and that had written this collective paper. And from my 2014 visit and then the later visit in 2020 here, I could see how much this place was, a lively place for research and thinking about the future of economics, and as much as the future, the fundamentals of economics. And so that is probably, one of the reasons why it made a lot of sense for me when I was brought with the news that this award was attributed to our work at ISSB. And this is the second part of the collective. I'm here with Sue Lloyd, the vice chair of ISSB, Richard, who's joined us from Oxford to become a board member of ISSB full-time, and my colleagues from the foundation, Mark and Harsha, here. And I'm citing those because Ben mentioned that there was a crowd of people that could have been considered for this prize. And my thinking is that without probably most of them, we would not receive this prize. What we do is completely collective and ecosystemic in the rewriting, in a way, of economics that ISSB has been tasked to do. The question is why? Why did it start? And I can bring my own view on that, because having been a CFO, a CEO, a chair of a listed large entity for 25 years in total, or 23, my observation, quarterly calls after quarterly calls, and and investor conversations, and investor events, and capital markets days, and large acquisitions, $17 billion here, $15 billion there. I've been in the weeds of capital markets for a long time. And if you observe today that the market to book value multiple is 5 times, and that even during the subprime crisis, it only went down to 2 times, and now it's back to 5, which is the highest, the last peak being 25 years ago during the internet bubble. You can start questioning the proportionality of the role of accounting, book value, to the valuation and the capital allocation in terms of both price and volume by investors. Apparently, they see a lot of value, I'm sorry to say, outside of the financial statements. Simply this book value ratio is there to say that. It's a fact. And if you go into the book value itself, you find out that goodwills are about 70% of the entire book value of a balance sheet. And that has grown over time from 30% probably 15, 20 years ago, and much less probably in the previous century. So I'm not going to discuss at all the accounting of goodwill. I'm not disputing the notion of goodwill, but it's a fact that the vast majority of that book value is actually made today of judgments and estimates that are beyond the pure recognition of the financial statements in the short term, and that are there to sit expressing the fact that in French we have this wonderful word we call goodwill sur valeur. It's above the value. It's value on top of. Top of what? I don't know, but on top of. And then you dissect that again, and you go to the fact that a goodwill, and then that's not accounting, it's valuation parameters. That I went into investment banking for a while, and we've run numbers and DCF calculations and NPVs and all the rest of it. In a DCF, discounted cash flow valuation for an acquisition, terminal value is anywhere between 75 and 95% of the value that you pay. 75 to 95%. It's very simple to run the math. You do a few scenarios and you'll find out super hard to go below that number of 75%. And that is terminal value. So after 5 years, after 10 years, after 20 years, depending on the industry in which you operate and the choices that are made by the management to reflect the value in their discussions with the board and ultimately potentially with the shareholders. But if you go down into what a terminal value is made of, that's the last year's cash flow in the projection, so year 10, put it this way, that you divide by a subtraction of the cost of capital, the WACC, minus the magic number. It's a letter. Seeing smiles here. The G letter. G is the growth to perpetuity of cash flow. So all these very reasonable people with nice ties I have, they're thinking hard and they say, that's a GD plus growth type of industry. I'm going to compound down to perpetuity. If you look at the corporate finance books, they would tell you long-term growth. But as we don't have anything to model, the actual long-term growth, if you do the integral part of this mathematically, you lead to the WACC minus G. And so G is perpetuity growth. So if you construct that back, book value is only a fifth of the price of how people are allocating capital on the market. 70% of that is goodwill. 90% of goodwill is related to an assumption that has been made on how this business is going to grow to perpetuity. So I think we just can pause on that and have an observation that accounting counts a lot of super important things, but apparently they don't count everything that is useful for the capital allocation. Otherwise, we wouldn't have these numbers here. I think the other aspect is that probably when the model for capital asset pricing model was thought through a few decades, a number of decades ago, I think, a lot of us were not there. I guess probably most of us were not there. But the vision at that point in time was a vision of a theoretical, perfectly efficient market in which the notion of growth was a given. There was going to be growth. There was going to be progress. There was going to be expansion of the value in a manner which my own personal experience have been living and working in Asia, based in China for a few years, about 20 years ago, until probably 2008, 2007, the Chinese Olympic Games, the subprimes. Until those moments, we had the illusion that the world was going to become a village. And accounting, the IFRS accounting, in 140 jurisdictions around the world with an equivalence with the US GAAP, would become the language of economics. And this is what happened. Except that now, I don't think we can say that we can reasonably predict that the current growth and economics is going to be there in the next 32 years. Why am I talking about the next 32 years? For a simple reason. The math that I just described before are that if you take the average S&P 500 price to earning ratio, the PE ratio, this is 32 times. 32 times the profits of this year is what on average you pay as an investor in the S&P 500, which means 32 years. So in the modern world, this world in which we live now, this world in which the ISSB started in 2021, is that reasonable to assume that financial statements are good enough to predict the value of the business in 32 years from now? Probably not. And this is why, way before ISSB started, a number of initiatives were taken from a voluntary basis to try to disclose and express stuff that weren't in the MD&A, that weren't in the general purpose financial reporting, and that certainly were not in the financial statements. And they were voluntary initiatives. They were called at some point, 15 years after that, the alphabet soup of ESG. As many acronyms as anyone. And at the end of the day, they did not change the paradigm. They were costly because there were so many, and you still need to prepare them seriously, but they are voluntary. So in one set of industry, Nestlé could choose one, Danone could choose another one, and Mars could choose a third one. By the way, you change the CFO or the CEO, he likes or she likes rather that one rather, and so let's change. It's like, you are in a situation where back in the days, in the 1930s in the US, there were company gaps. There weren't gaps. Any company had its own agreed principle, and they were assuring, the auditors were assuring against those principles. But in the same industry, there was not a single gap to speak and discuss about the economics of that industry. That is where the ESG alphabet soup is. Except that it's not even a gap, it's not even assurable. It's there can be limited assurance, etc., uncertain, but it's not the assurance as we know it in accounting. So with all of that, there has been, particularly in the mounting climate issues and the level of awareness of the risks related to climate change. In the decade from 2010 to 2020, a mounting ask and preparatory work for the construction of something that would be the ISSB. And the IFRS Foundation, being the provider of tools for accounting that were then used by regulators in deciding to adopt them or to amend them one way or the other, or develop standards that are aligned with them, on 140 jurisdictions around the world, has been seen by multilateral organizations, the IMF, the World Bank, the UN, the OECD, but also large investors, the G7, the G20, the Financial Stability Board, the IOSCO, as being the place where it could happen. Could there be a situation where, with the knowledge on accounting of the IFRS Foundation, with its due process, with its monitoring board, could there be a situation where, next to the IASB, an ISSB for sustainability disclosures would be formed, mirroring its sister board, and start working to create a language that would describe everything that sits between the financial statements and the market value, basically. And this is what happened. So I'm telling you all of that because this award, when it comes to the ISSB, is for the last 3 years. But all of that has started like 30 years ago already. And so many collective organizations and people have been working in preparing what we are doing right now, that I just want to mention that as part of the legacy on which we are building from pioneers that's been there. So in many ways, what I think we are doing, as much as you have generally accepted accounting principles, and that lead to the financial statements as we know them as part of general purpose financial reporting, we are building generally accepted principles for the risk, the accounting of risks and opportunities, the everything that is basically not transpiring in the recognition for the financial statements. So typically, what would that mean in, again, a world that is going to change in the 32 years of profits that are embedded in the price of now, and in the value chains that are way beyond the legal boundaries of the company itself, identifying all the risks and the opportunities that are there in the horizon and the horizons of time, the short, the mid, and the long term. That is basically what IFRS Sustainability 1, IFRS S1, our general requirement standard, is providing for. The requirement for companies to look at all these risks and opportunities in a very comprehensive manner, in the sense that we provide in IFRS S1, the first paragraph of IFRS S1, something that says that essentially an entity forms an interdependent ecosystem with its stakeholders, suppliers, the resources, the natural resources, human resources, the customers, the investors, of course, and many others. So this, we are saying there is an inextricable link between the ability of a company over time to create value for itself and its shareholders, and the way it creates value or destroys for others. That inextricable link is part of the complexity that we add to the financial statements in order to ensure that all information that can be material for a capital information is going to be provided for in this analysis, the scanning of horizons, space, and time. So, contrary probably to a lot of the thinking about ESG, thinking about sustainability as you see it here, sustainability disclosures, what we do is thinking about the first part, future-proofing capital markets. What we are designing, as I just said, with these generally accepted accounting principles for risks and opportunities is future-proofing the model, ensuring that beyond an entity that can report on a particular risk, all entities in a given industry, and sometimes thematically, would report the same way, on the same disclosures, the same metrics, the same language, so that there is comparability. What happens if there is comparability? There is the ability for an investor, for a bank, to compare the level of risks, resilience, efficiency in the strategy to address a potential opportunity or manage a potential risk between two competitors within the same industry. And therefore, when you allocate capital within one set of industry, you choose and pick not only on the latest quarterly earning and some vague comments on guidance by the management, but on robust analysis on beyond the short term, what is it that I should know that is going to affect the company's prospects over time. And this is why purely relying without these tools on the company's ability, willingness to expand more, even if the company does its maximum, unless it does the same as the entity an investor wants to compare for, the investor is not able to price differently the risk, and therefore you cannot future-proof the capital markets. Developing one unique set of language that is comparable, reliable, assurable is what we do. And it is absolutely necessary. There is none of these forwards, it doesn't work with, if one of these forwards miss, for the capital markets, for the banks, ultimately the supervision of the bank's risks and others to be able to do and perform their duty properly. What is in it for companies and entities? It's basically rethinking your competitive advantages by taking those aspects into account. Climate can be a risk or can be an opportunity. Water access can be a risk or an opportunity. Human capital can be a risk and an opportunity, etc., etc. So you bring lenses and you look, you scan your business over the value chains and in the time horizons in a manner that you can be actually better than your competitor in addressing one of those, and you will then have a cost of capital that will be lower. The bank, margin on the interest rate will be lower. The market price mechanism will allocate capital at a lower price and more capital to your company if you're able to do that. So you're essentially bringing this huge chunk of overvalue, as I called it, this value that is not accounted for, which is sitting somewhere in the market, into privatizing those aspects of the value and ensuring that companies can take those on board and develop their own competitive advantage in the conversations with investors and with their lenders. So for instance, when a super large software company in the US, based in the US, headquartered in the US, wants to restart a nuclear power plant to have enough power for a huge digital farm that will nourish its AI ambitions. Of course, the PE ratio that you get on that is going to be AI PE ratio, like, the more you lose money, the more you have value because you invest. I'm not criticizing. It's obvious that this stage of development needs to exist. When it exists at this sort of the order of magnitude of what AI is, it can be a bit scary, but it's quite normal that it is the case. But For us, the question would not be, if I think about sustainability disclosures, whether it's good or bad to do nuclear, whether nuclear should be considered as a green or a yellow or light blue or dark blue thing. It is not for us to decide that. The question that IFRS S1 would require that company to ask is, this power plant was built in 1968 with the Susquehanna River there on the basis of the volume and the temperature of water that was carried by the river at that period of time, actually even 10 years before that. So we're like 60 years later now. And we look at the 32 next years. In the 32 next years, what's going to be that river? So you run climate scenario, you look at the water availability and what can happen or not happen, you may find a situation where you're not going to be able to operate your nuclear power plant at full capacity. And being a French person, we have lots of nuclear power plants on the Rhone River. And 2 years ago, we all discovered during the heat wave that, oh my God, beyond 26 degrees on the Rhone River, we had to stop the plants. We couldn't cool them anymore. And stopping a power plant, a nuclear power plant, is very costly. So if you do not operate it at near full capacity and regularly, it's just economically, it doesn't work. So in the context of that river, and you look at other rivers, like the Colorado River, that doesn't even go into the Gulf of California anymore. It dies in Mexico before reaching the river, the sea, because of the overconsumption, because of evaporation, the irrigation of agriculture on both sides of the border. You can ask yourself whether the Susquehanna River will have enough water. My office is near, is in Frankfurt, so near the Rhine River. The Rhine River doesn't have enough water for the last 3 summers because of the heat waves, because of the lack of glaciers coming down, because of some rain events that did not occur, and a number of other parameters that are changing, to the point that the barges have to be stopped. And the first time it happened, like 3 years ago, the operators had to bring smaller barges, a third of the size of the barges, from all over the place in Europe, just to be able to continue to carry with a thinner, a shallower amount of water in the Rhine River. You can imagine in Rotterdam, the huge piles of stocks just waiting to be imported into Europe, and on the other side, at the outside of going outside, all the supply chain disruption, because those components that were built in Germany that were needed somewhere else were not there. Inflation, interest rates, renting space that you have to do, penalties because you do not supply in time, and all the rest of it. To the point that the Bundesbank last year, in October, in their third quarter inflation alert, mentioned that event, that climate changes are a factor of inflation. So that I'm just describing those mechanics because this is not about knowing whether fluvial navigation is good or bad. It's a good it's not that. It's not again about judging what's good or bad, what companies should or should not do, what regulators should or should not do, what policymakers should do or not. It's simply about ensuring that the people that pay 32 years of profit today have a bit of an understanding beyond the next 3 years what can happen in certain circumstances. So I'll stop here on what our tools are meant to do. Just a word, because I think that without that, I would not be speaking to you with this award for the team, is the incredible support that we received since we started early 22, so a bit less than 4 years ago. The two initial standards, inaugural standards, IFRS S1, the general requirements, which is a quasi-accounting language, and IFRS S2, which is on climate, were finalized in June 23. So that was 18 months after we started officially. But again, many people had started before, and we built from where they were. We received the endorsement from a body called the ISSB, which is the membership organization that gathers 135 regulators, capital markets regulators around the world. So the FCA here in the UK, and the US SEC, and the Chinese Minister of Finance, and Japan FCA, et cetera, et cetera. 135. Their board unanimously endorsed the standards 1 month after they were issued. We had lots of conversations with them. But basically, that instance is the one that did the same 25 years ago when the IFRS accounting standards, which were the IASC at that point in time, were issued, putting a stamp fit for purpose for capital markets. And this is what led 25 years ago to the situation now with the IFRS accounting around the world. So receiving that endorsement by ISSB at that point in time was a really critical moment for us. That started the momentum for jurisdictions to come and knock on the door and decide to adopt or otherwise use our standards because they had the same view as the one I just described about how useful that could be. And so we are now 2 years after this summer 23, and there are roughly a bit less than 40 jurisdictions around the world that have committed and started to adopt or otherwise use our standards in their own regulation of their own capital markets, domestic capital markets, for banks and for capital markets, basically. So those 40 jurisdictions are a really interesting group because it's a very diverse group. You have, G7 countries, and so that's Canada, that's Japan, and others. You have countries of, as is referred to, global south, like we have Botswana, and we have Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh, and Philippines, and Zimbabwe that are there in the list. You have GDPs that rely a lot on extractive industries. I mentioned Canada, Australia, but also services like Singapore. So a very diverse group overall, but one that, if you count the sum of those, is about 60% of global GDP. So just to mention that very few of them have already started to actually use the standards. They are on the journey of installing the standards in their regulation. Turkey was the first. Nigeria was actually the first to announce that they would early adopt at COP27 in 2023. But yeah, Turkey already started. The first reports were issued on a mandatory basis in Turkey this year. Brazil was on a voluntary basis, some very interesting reports from Brazil as well. But that group of jurisdiction is going to gradually, year after year, introduce the standards. The one thing I just want to say is that success, quote unquote, in the take-up wouldn't be there if we had not been collectively working in listening to how much such a complex language, a new language, would need to be learned. What does that mean actually to learn the language? What are the proportionality mechanisms that we would introduce? And we borrowed a lot from the accounting concepts to ensure that there was proportionality in the way the standards were going to be applied by companies. But the fact that jurisdictions from the global south were taking those standards meant that we probably were in the right spot in terms of ensuring that proportionality and scalability for economies and companies that may not have the resources of a multinational company like the one I've been working with in. So that is where we are now. There's still an enormous amount of work that will now mean in each of those markets, those jurisdictions, how quickly and well the standards are applied to cover as much capital as possible, because ultimately what led that choice of the trustees of the IFRS Foundation to create ISSB with the market needs and the demand from the multilaterals and the financial institutions around the world that I described before, is the vision and the mission of the IFRS Foundation, which is simple but hard to make it happen: better information for better decisions. So this is what we are looking for. The more capital will be informed, capital allocation will be informed by the ISSB standards, the reports issued from the ISSB standards, the more the market will have information to make better decisions. If you think about it from a resilience standpoint, back to future-proofing, the future-proofing of capital markets is not only for the future-proofing of capital markets, it's for the future-proofing of the businesses themselves. The same thing I was saying at the macro level earlier is also obviously completely true at the micro level, which is the level at which we work. The reporting of each company on its risks and opportunities, its resilience. So it's about allowing companies to think and to report about their own resilience and how they go about it in terms of governance and strategy and risk and the metrics and the target that they have, because this is what separates the big 32 years of their market pricing versus what they just delivered that current year. So it's absolutely critical that they apply the standards in an appropriate manner so they can be assured and investors can finally trust the information to the point that they will starting to make decisions. The winners at the end is everyone, because the companies will be able to fund the transition towards the resilience that they're looking for, whatever resilient that means. And again, it's not a matter of good or bad or colors. It's risks that are underlying. And some of these risks might actually rely in impacts that they have. Of course, the risk will come significantly from the dependencies and the relationship that they have, but also from the impacts. Not all the impacts, but a number of impacts. For instance, scope 3 in Europe. Europe has a decarbonation strategy that says minus 85% versus 1995 in 2040, minus 85%. Well, if you supply thermal engines in Europe, you probably have to think before you create a new factory, or you may have to write it off partly in less than 10 years' time. This is tomorrow, 2040. So what we are talking about here is, yes, impacts. You can think about greenhouse gas emissions as impact. They are. I mean, even scope 1 and 2. They are impacts. They are captured by our standards to the extent that they give rise to a risk or to an opportunity that can affect the company's prospect and that are serious enough to be reported because they could influence an investor decision. So this is the whole mechanism that we have in place, and therefore this is why, based on that, companies can actually obtain the funding that they need to transition towards a model that is resilient, because the ones that are able to prove that they're going to be more resilient or more efficiently going to be resilient, they will be the winners. At the end of the day, the future-proofing of finance is also the future-proofing of economics. And economics is nothing different than our way of living. And I will just close with that by saying that we hear a lot, and Ben was referring to this turbulent world in which we live. It's true. I don't think that's just the last couple of years. I mean, I was describing what probably the 60s were like, you know, this feeling of linear growth and development and progress model. That's going to be different. And the one thing just that I would like to plant in your thinking at that moment and before we go to questions is, We hear that ESG is gone. That was the fad of 10 years ago. And now it's all about geopolitics or AI or whatever you want, and we can discuss. And that, sustainability, well, that was, there was momentum and tailwind maybe 5 years ago. You see the Green Deal in Europe, and then the Green Deal is not what it was supposed to become. And so, yeah, there is that. But the truth is that the geopolitical risks and the changes, let's put that this way, the geopolitical changes, pretty radical changes since a few years, are not erasing the sustainability and the resilience concerns or opportunities. They are rising them. There are a multiplier of those risks. Just think about what happened during COVID, where suddenly the global supply chains were cut for a few months, the lockdowns. Suddenly you didn't have toilet paper here, and you didn't have baguette in Paris anymore, and you didn't have baby food in the industry in which I was working, simply because the supply chains were cut and we didn't have a backup plan. There was no resilience. It was all about efficiency. Well, if you think about where the barriers can come, whatever those barriers are going to be in the next 5, 10, 15 years, if you look at how water availability will be a competitive advantage all over the place, access to water, just look at what happens between Afghanistan and Pakistan, between Ethiopia now and Egypt on the Nile River. And that was the same with around Euphrates River, and the same in Panama, and the same in Colorado in a way. The Colorado River needs to be desalinated at Yuma, at the frontier of Mexico, before it goes into Mexico. All of that, how are you sure you're going to have the water that you need, basically, as a business? Because if in cities like Chennai, which are like probably 10 million inhabitants now in India, for the last 10 years there have been 0 water day in Chennai. Days where you turn the tap and there is no water. Riots immediately. And the transition risk there is that if you have an industry that is next to that city, you won't get your water. You won't get that water until the inhabitants can actually drink. So, and again, if you don't access the water on the other side of any frontier, a regional frontier, a national frontier, whatever it is, or a natural frontier, or because simply the temperature elevation has been such that you don't have water anymore there, that is a factor of lack of resilience. So for anyone that thinks that now it's all about geopolitics and forget about resilience and what is supposed to be ESG, which is absolutely not our topic. Our topic is the risks and the opportunities in the value chains and time horizons. This tool, IFRS S1, is even more important to face those situations than before they arrived. And so back to what I just mentioned before, we saw a lot of momentum. There are headwinds all over the place, but we will keep, hopefully collectively with my colleagues on the board and all the teams within the foundation, a very pragmatic, disciplined approach to what we do in order to gradually install those tools in a manner that they will indeed future-proof the capital markets. So thank you so much for your attention.
Emmanuel, thank you so much for that really insightful lecture. Lots of food for thought. And now we're lucky to have some time with you. We have senior professors here, we have students, we have early career researchers, we have policymakers, regulators, people from financial institutions, people from the real economy. So lots of different perspectives. Who wants to go first? We're going to take maybe 2 questions at a time. If you could say who you're with and your position there, that would be really helpful. Who you are and who you're with. And if you could wait for the microphone. Who wants to go first? Okay, Simon at the front. And then the lady there next.
Good evening, I'm Simon Connell with Baringa Partners. I was really interested because in your remarks, I heard you describe S1 as solving two problems. It's solving a strategy problem of where risks and opportunities are and how business thinks forward, whilst also solving a finance problem of how you measure that and bring that into financial statements. And I was just wondering, in all the consultation you've done, in the adoption that you're seeing, which of those two challenges are senior leadership teams valuing more?
Yeah. Thanks for the question. Oh, you want to take a second one?
Yeah, let's do it.
Sorry. Yeah.
Thanks. My name is Juliette Cocheter. I'm a PhD candidate in economics here. So you mentioned, you gave a quote in your talk, which was better information for better decisions. And I'm interested in hearing more about the reception from the investor side of the IFRS S1. Does it actually lead to better decisions? And do you have anecdotal evidence or research evidence to speak about that? Thanks.
So, Simon, your question. I'm not sure that we solve a strategy problem in and by itself, because we do not prescribe what companies should be doing. But that creates an opportunity for them that if they want to explain what they do voluntarily, they can. And here's a tool that makes it. But also we realize that if this is going to be mandatory, that they report on that, they can say they don't have a strategy. They can, really. But then that's a matter of market forces. So that's what I would say. From a regulator standpoint, I'd say that it was, first and foremost, a lot of the time, it's not even a regulator standpoint itself. It's the Ministry of Finance themselves. Sometimes the governments that realize what that tool can bring them. In a lot of emerging economies, it's about bringing international capital to foreign direct investment, basically, and listed and non-listed circumstances locally. There's a dire need for foreign direct investments in many of these countries. Others have had a look at the trade issues, because you're basically understanding, for instance, that in Europe there might be the CBAM coming. If you import from Africa a lot of goods or Brazil, a lot of stuff in the EU, by having companies to report on their emissions, you basically future-proof your trade, because these are the measurements that will be the basis for the CBAM mechanism. If you are in a value chain of European companies, one way or the others. Some would, in particular, stock exchange would look at it as a more efficient capital market. Basically, what you do with that is that you privatize the implied volatility in the market, because you're privatizing the risks and opportunities into the appropriate capital allocation, whereas they sit somewhere blurred, and the day there is a problem, the whole market is suffering. And so that creates the opportunity of having a more precise capital allocation on a particular stock exchange. Importantly, though, I'd also say that it's not entirely, we were certainly surprised that so many would be coming so fast, and certainly in a manner that is also so consistent with our standards. There are very little partial adoption or partial use. A lot of them are committing to a full adoption, basically, of the standards, understanding that it will bring this fluidity that I was talking about. But it is an investment. We've seen a number of jurisdictions in which the capital market has a big role, and where concerns were about potential delisting if there was not a proportionate approach as to where it should go down the list of the size of listing of the companies. If you think about Canada, where you have, out of the 6,000 companies that are listed, 3,000 of them are what they call the small venture companies, in particular the Western provinces. 3,000 that are like 5 million Canadian dollar revenue. There's no way that they can do that, and it's not fit for their purpose. So making sure that you're proportionate as a regulator to where exactly you put the burden has been another thing. And the other thing is really about, in particular, on climate, where there is a bit of, not a bit, there is a lot of pure technical measurement when it comes to scope 1 and 2 and 3, the various categories and all the rest of it. We provided transition relief structurally in the standards, in particular with the option of starting with climate for 1 year, and then 1 year relief for scope 3 if needed within the standard itself, because we know scope 3 is more difficult in a number of ways to capture. So the flip side and the is really how much pushback am I going to get from the corporate sector? That is one of the important stakeholders locally, of course, and whether from a listing standpoint this is not going to be moving the needle too fast in terms of cost of reporting on a particular market. So that would be the two main aspects on both the plus and the minuses. To your question, Juliet, I think we've seen a few really good ISSB reports, but as I just said, the first reports were issued this year from Turkey on 2024 data. So the 25 campaign is the first campaign in Turkey. And the other one is in Brazil, where it's formally permitted this year, where there have been a couple of really good reports coming. So it's way too early to say at this stage.
Possibly a hot topic for research as part of the PhD,
yeah,
maybe.
Of course.
Okay, we're going to go right to the back. So there are two hands right at the back. So there was a lady who was first, and then one of the two gentlemen behind her.
Hi, I'm Emma Le Cavalier. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Oxford Climate Policy Hub. And I was interested to hear how you set out this sort of theory of change as it emerges through the standards. And it seemed to me a lot of this really relies upon implicitly effective or accurate assessments of risk. And I'm wondering to what extent you feel like companies and financial institutions are actually, adequately equipped to undertake sophisticated or, really high integrity scenario analyses. And if not, where do you see there being real opportunities to kind of develop that space more?
Hi, my name is Ashish, and I run a social impact platform based in India called MASH. And currently, I'm visiting my wife, who is an MBA at the State Business School. Firstly, it's a great honor to listen to you, Emmanuel. A big fan of Danone's work, and I've been worked with some of your programs in India and other regions. Quick question in terms of, you talked about Global South, right? So one thing is that while the impact outcomes in the Global South are pretty strong, but the capabilities in terms of disclosures are very, very limited. And as AI is shaping and there's so much advancement in technologies, right? What trends do you see where we can adopt technology at a lower cost and see that, opportunities emerging for Global South to be kind of bridge this financing gap? That's one. And secondly, also in terms of the global supply chains, right? So especially focus on scope 3 emission is growing a lot, right? How do you see countries or regions like Europe, which are pretty, I would say, advanced or getting, in terms of their compliances being more, more stronger than other regions of the world? So again, how do you see this gap between global supply chains from other parts of the world, and what opportunities for small, medium enterprises as well? Those two things. Thank you.
So I'll start with your question, I guess. We're conscious of the fact that, in particular, climate scenario analysis is a demanding thing. And we have built from the TCFD guidance as to how to run those climate scenarios, and we refer to this guidance ourselves. It's a learning process. I do believe that there are already sectors basically that are deeply into it and for a while already, and that's obvious, like insurance, P&C. I mean, they are all over the place on those topics, and they know how to run this scenario. My corporate background would say that there's nothing. It's not rocket science. You need to pick a scenario that makes sense for you, and think about why it makes sense other than others. And we are referring to a number of cases and guiding in our guidance as to why a certain scenario would make sense for you in certain circumstances. And it's like, I see companies that I've been sitting on the board of an airline company in a previous life, non-executive board. And we had jet fuels options, and we had Japanese operating leases options on hundreds of airlines that we were going to buy or order, et cetera, et cetera. This company was running plenty of scenarios that were not climate, but scenarios on, the price of oil is a pretty complex mechanism, and I'm not sure anyone can actually win against the market on this one. And so running scenario is something that businesses know how to do anyway. And I started this conversation, in my initial speech by referring to the mechanisms that lead to goodwill presence in the balance sheet. If a board is ready to sign, and PwC or whoever else is ready to sign on a balance sheet that projects perpetuity growth of cash flows on a big acquisition, I'm not sure there is any particular barrier in running climate scenario analysis in a certain geography or in a certain place, with a 10 or 15 year or even 30 years horizon. So I'm long here because I think that, mechanically, what happens in these circumstances of changes is that you've got words that become walls and roadblocks. So climate scenario analysis, that's a big thing, and it is, but it's it's also where people's attention would gather to say, not possible, climate scenario analysis too difficult. Or scope 3 has been the case in a number of jurisdictions. And then suddenly many lower people are actually talking about this because they've started the work. So I just want to say that we are very proportionate. We have set particular reliefs on climate scenario analysis within the standards themselves, so that remains assurable for depending on the capabilities of the company. I guess too early to say in practice, but we have consulted on this climate requirement in 2022. We received 1,500 letters of comments, met 30,000 people, and we redeliberated on the basis of what they told us and took these additional reliefs and making sure we were proportionate as far as the final standards, fit for purpose, endorsed by IOSCO. So that is why I was referring to the due process of the IFRS Foundation. It's unique, and it is respected because it is so collective and paying attention to where the market needs and how prepared the market is or is not on a topic like this one. But to Juliet's point earlier, it's too early to say. We don't know yet. We haven't seen it in practice enough to know. So we will see. To your questions about global South value chains, the proportionality, your point is absolutely fundamental. It was very clear for us that we were tasked to build what was called a comprehensive global baseline to answer the common needs of investors, a comprehensive. So it can be, half of what investors need. It's got to be what investors need. And that should be an inclusive global baseline. Inclusive. That's why I mentioned what I mentioned earlier. about all these wonderful jurisdictions from Global South being part of that first cohort of 40. They're actually the biggest part of the cohort in terms of numbers. And I think the first thing is what I referred to, which is that we use proportionality mechanisms that ensures that for instance, like in accounting, you are not required to provide information if there is undue cost or effort. You're required to provide information on the basis that it's supportable and reasonable. And all of that is no news. I mean, this is how accounting has been built. And what is supportable and reasonable for a company, a small company in Europe or a maybe slightly larger company in Kenya, but I don't even know if that is relevant comparison, is going to be entirely the judgment of the management and the auditors about what's reasonable and what's not. So I think that is a very important aspect. The second aspect is capacity building. We went way, 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 way beyond just writing standards. From the first day of the standards, we actually decided that we would have 2 vice chairs. I honored the presence here of my dear Vice Chair Sue Lloyd. Sue was actually the vice chair of the IASB. So she's well known for some of your favorite accounting standards. If you want to speak to her, she's here. She's the one guilty for that. But Sue has brought an incredible amount of value. You can imagine why. We just picked the bookshelf of the IASB and made it an accounting language for this gap that we're creating for the risks and opportunities. But we also decided that we would have another vice chair, and that is Jingdong Hua, who was, before joining us, the vice president and treasurer of the World Bank. He's got 30 years of experience between IFC, World Bank, and the multilaterals, has been visiting 128 countries in his career with the World Bank, and he is tasked with the capacity building. So we have MOUs and agreements with the World Bank, the IMF, the African Development Bank, the Asian Investment Bank, the IDB in Latin America, just to make sure that they would support regulators in providing budget support to regulators to train the accounting profession, the regulators, and others, the market participants in those geographies. And I couldn't emphasize more the importance of that, because that, I mean, we can't get those jurisdictions to fail. If we are not global, it does not work. And so it's a very conscious decision that we've made to overinvest on that particular aspect. And the last thing to your point about SMEs and AI and the rest of it, we do have an office in Beijing. So we have 3 big hubs today, Frankfurt, Montreal, and Beijing, and other offices in various places. The IFRS Foundation itself is headquartered here in London. We've got an office in Tokyo for Asia Oceania. We've got a San Francisco office with the SASB standards where they were based. So we're basically all over the place. In Beijing in particular, we are developing a center of excellence on data collection from SMEs in the supply chain. Because we do believe, and that's true for all the region, of course, and globally, we do believe that there is a lot of value for the future proofing of this collective exercise, that we can get SMEs information without bothering SMEs in the supply chains. Yet they need to be part of it, otherwise they will be excluded. And I'll just say one thing here, by experience. At Danone, we started disclosing scope 1, 2, and 3 in 2009. So that was some years ago. I can tell you we never, ever went to a farm and asked the farmer to calculate its own scope 1 and 2. We didn't need that. We knew by experience and then learning, and there were more and more databases that with a particular conditions of the agriculture, the type of crop, and the type of agriculture on it, what was the bandwidth of the emissions, and how many cows, methane, and what type of cereals were grown, et cetera, et cetera. And we were probably wrong by 20% when we started, but I can tell you that 10 years later, that was all over the place in the ERP system and the management accounting, and that was budgeted exactly the same way we would budget on any kind of volume or a brand here or Actimel or whatever you want. And so I really believe that it's a matter of time, and you can find ways of not going to ask. I'll use an example. In China, one of the very first things that happened in the conversations with the regulators and the standard setters, which happened to be the same, the Minister of Finance, they were very clear that if there is a cement company somewhere, they are not going to ask that cement company to calculate its scope 3. They know what the output is. They know their electricity mix. They know it's a very local market, cement. And based on that, they would say that's the number. Scope 3 is that number. And maybe they'll be right by 10%. But who cares when the difference between book value and the market value is that big. And so that element of pragmatism, I think, is critical to get the smaller companies part of the system.
Okay, sorry. Now we've got time for 2 quick questions. Only 1 question. No extensive preamble. Okay, now I've got to decide. James, over there, gentleman there, and Caroline down here.
Hi, good evening. James Mitchell from Climate Markets and Investments Association. How are you seeing, or how do you expect ISSB reporting to become a genuine driver of strategic change in organizations rather than a siloed reporting exercise? Thank you.
I'm Caroline Litton, currently COO of the Smith School, but I'm asking this with my 22-year career in project finance hat on mostly. So how confident are you that combining the work of the ISSB so far with the work of bodies like ICMA and the LMA in terms of defining labelled products in the capital markets, that we have a complete toolbox for the future in terms of keeping finance flowing to transform the world? Or do you believe that there is another piece of work that somebody in this room needs to crack on with? Thank you.
Both great questions.
Yeah, they're wonderful questions. Thank you, James and Caroline. So on the question of siloed that you just mentioned, I think if that stays siloed, it's a failure. It's, we haven't reached the target. We just shot not at the right place. We were having that conversation with 24 of investors, the 3 of us actually, a couple of hours ago. There are some, I know we are out of time, are we? But that's my only lecture here, probably, so.
Got to make the most of it.
Okay, all right.
None of you being here. So.
No, I think it's important. The large companies start to be preparing for reporting in 10 or 15 of those jurisdictions. And sometimes the jurisdictions have developed standards themselves that are producing the same effect as our standards, but slightly differently written for a number of reasons. And they add a few things to it. Sometimes they add a lot of things. And those global companies are asking whether, instead of having to repeat the same, not repeat actually, but replicate the language in Australia, in Singapore, in China, and et cetera, could they use for their local subsidiaries, when the local subsidiary is, for instance, not listed, but they would even try when it's listed, to use the consolidated version of the thing. So they would do an ISSB report at the consolidated level, and they would seek to push it to explain to investors in their local Australian subsidiaries what the investors might be interested in the risks and opportunities of that local subsidiary. It doesn't work. It just does not work. I mean, we're talking about Danone. I had the great integrated reports of Danone in 20 different languages, on the shelf of any lounge in the headquarters in Indonesia, in China, et cetera, et cetera. But they describe the global company. They don't describe the local company on which the risks are, or if you are a bank, or if the company is listed, the minority shareholders that are there next to the big parent holding in the business. And this is the silo approach. I think that is exactly what we need to crack, which is that as long as ESG-ish, or whatever that is, continues to be done aside, like by the communication department, by the foundation, by the corporate sustainability reporting, stuff or responsibility. Sorry, it's a failure. This is the current system. It just does not provide the information. The only way it can work is that you take the language, you put it in your ERP, Oracle, SAP, whatever it is, next to oil price, volumes, inflation, whatever. You have carbon, just to use the example of carbon, but you have a lot of other things, safety at work and a lot of other things. I just don't know them, depending on industry and whatever. And you aggregate them in your management accounting the same way you aggregate them when you manage other important business parameters. And with that, you have a system where it gets budgets, it gets reforecasts, it gets strategic plans, it gets risks management, audit committees, boards, shareholders. So I personally don't think that companies that will seek to impose the system from a top down and not having those local things will succeed. So it's very simple. I agree with you that we will fail if that is the case, that it doesn't change. It also depends on what regulators are going to ask, because for the time being, the concern of these companies is that regulators want to know the truth locally. That's what they are interested in. Whatever version of the truth they want to see, but they want the local stuff. And as far as we're concerned, our theory of change is about the risks and the opportunities. We are saying that this is part of general purpose financial reporting. So that report needs to be attached and consistent with the financial statements. So what's the consistency if you attach, the Danone global report to the Indonesian subsidiary that is listed? So that would be my response. Caroline, to your point, I think there could be different layers here. As long as it's about the common need of investors, I think we provide the appropriate infrastructure. You've seen, maybe, I'm sure you have, that, for instance, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and ISO have agreed that they would merge basically their suite of standards to go from product level to corporate level disclosure. That is an effect of the gravitational force that ISSB is creating by using the Greenhouse Gas Protocol in now 40 jurisdictions, going to be mandatory. And so I think that these connections will continue to be built, and that will include carbon pricing at some point in time. And so I think we provide a brick which is necessary, and that on which people will be able to build whatever is needed. I can't leave this room, I think, without yet saying that there is also the question of addressing systemic risks and addressing policy requirements that are not related to risks and opportunities, or addressing stakeholders that are interested in the performance of a company outside of its risk and opportunities. And my experience has been, including using GRI for a lot of time, that those themes can be important. The future-proofing of capital markets is not a policy. It's a policy-neutral thing. And it's absolutely obvious that we live in a world where policy have a critical role to play to shape the future, whatever the future they see fit or populations see fit for their own policy-making agents. Our role here is not again to define the color of the taxonomies or what is good or what is bad. It's to be, on the contrary, to be totally policy neutral, but that leaves a lot of space to build from that for policy non-agnostic tools to build. Our global response is, at this stage, that we work with GRI to ensure that the 14,000 companies that report on GRI today, with a number of companies that might want to continue to report on GRI, and a number of jurisdictions that might want to continue to favor and maybe want to require multi-stakeholder requirements in terms of information, that the ISSB plus GRI solution can be a seamless solution, so that we reduce the burden of reporting for those regulators that want both, and for those companies that would decide even voluntarily to have both. But it's simply the recognition that what we do is important, I think necessary for what is there, but there is not the summary of what needs to be done.
Emmanuel, thank you so much for that talk and for answering the questions, a tour de force. As you can tell from the questions you've had and the participation here this evening, huge appetite for you to come back. So hopefully we can get you back to Oxford soon. That would be great. And I also, really wanted to thank you again for all the work that you do together with your team at the ISSB, and also to thank the ISSB and colleagues there for the huge impact you're having internationally on this agenda. So join me in thanking Emmanuel and his team.
Could you stand up? Stand up. Stand up, please. Stand up, please. That is the team. Thank you, team.
So a couple of other final things. So obviously drinks now. Before then, I just also wanted to thank two people in particular, so Alex Horgan and Philip Stevens, who have done a huge amount of the legwork for this event. So thank you to them. And as I said, please do look out for the recording links and share them widely with your networks. And looking forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you so much for coming.